Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a segment I like to call What's Under the Hood. And that's because while it's important to look at cosmetic appeal, design language, and overall aesthetics, often it's far more important to focus on what's on the inside. So today we're looking at the HP Omen 17 and the Maingear Vector Pro, two of the better 17.3-inch gaming laptops here in 2021. Both are expensive. This build roughly $2,000, this one $2,300. That's before tax for both of them. And again, the focus is going to be on the craftsmanship and overall engineering of the internals of the system. So let's go ahead and flip these over. And I've already taken the screws out because, quite frankly, how else are we going to see what's on the inside, right? And the HP Omen 17 is a favorite of mine. It really performs incredibly well. It is a little bit heavier, a couple pounds heavier than the Maingear Vector Pro, which is an Intel reference laptop design that Maingear has branded and is sold directly at Micro Center inside their stores as well as through their website. So let's go ahead and pop these off. Again, they should just come off. The Vector is easier to open for those of you that are wondering. So there we go with the Vector revealed. And the Omen has a lot more clips on its back lid, but there we have it. Now, before we get to the internals and the whole tour and essentially me covering at least all the things I've noticed, let's take a look at the back of these plates. So the Omen 17, this is standard for the entire line, and you know, it's pretty clean. This is a laptop that I think HP deserves a lot of credit in their redesign and their engineering. They did a really nice job, and that's also from an external point of view besides the internals that we're focusing on today. And then here I have the back plate for the Vector Pro. Again, this is branded as a Maingear machine, but ultimately it really is an Intel reference design. And you can see they actually have implemented the heatsink as well as thermal pads right here on the back lid, or I should say the bottom of the machine on the cover. So something just to be aware of. Now, putting these down, let's talk about the machines themselves. So in terms of specifications, we've got a Core i9, that's an Intel 11th gen processor, as opposed to a Core i7 11th gen processor. The only difference really being clock speed, a marginal one at that. And then when it comes to RAM, this is at least the configuration I got for review from HP, 16 gigs of Samsung DDR4 3200 RAM. Performance is perfectly fine. Over here, we've got 32 gigs of RAM, same specifications. The brand that comes with the Vector Pro is Gold Key, which is actually essentially house RAM for Micro Center. If you're not familiar with Gold Key, I imagine most of you are not going to be. And then in terms of GPUs, that's where both of these really shine beyond the CPU performance. We have an RTX 3070 with 140 watts of total power here, some of the best-in-class gaming performance you'll get out of a 3070. And then on the right with the Maingear Vector Pro, we've got an RTX 3080, the top of the line, 165 watts maximum power, even though this is a thin and light machine, which in some ways sounds too good to be true. Now, in terms of overall performance, this does, the Maingear Vector Pro, outperform the HP, but it should. It's got a 3080 with max power as opposed to a 3070 with max power, and that should be the tale of the tape. Also, remember, 16 gigs of VRAM for that 3080 as opposed to the 8 of dedicated VRAM for the 3070. In terms of Nvme drives, they both come stock with Samsung 980 Pros. I have to swap out. I right now have a Sabrent 4 terabyte Rocket 4 Plus Gen 4 drive. They're both Gen 4, both laptops. This is the Gen 4 drive that comes with the HP Omen. It actually outperforms the exact same Samsung drive that's inside the Maingear Vector Pro for whatever reason in synthetic benchmarking, but I don't think you'll see any real difference. Also, I noted that this is made in South Korea, whereas this Samsung 980 Pro is made in China. Is that noteworthy? Not really, but just something I wanted to point out. In terms of other specs you need to know, they both have Wi-Fi 6. The Maingear Vector Pro on its NVMe slots both support Gen 4 drives, whereas the Omen 17, which I love that we've got copper heat sinks here with thermal pads, Gen 4 in slot 1, Gen 3 in the secondary. That will probably get refreshed over time, but just something you need to be aware of out of the gate. Both have down-firing speakers, but the HP has more dynamic audio performance than the Maingear, I think just because of the chassis and the design. And other things that are noteworthy, I think most importantly what you're looking at now, outside of the specifications I've described, is the layout. So let's start off with the Maingear. You may have noticed already they've employed a lot of tape in putting this together. We've got tape on the battery to the Wi-Fi chipset. We've got tape on the cooling solutions. We've got some tape under the Nvme slots. And, you know, this isn't something I've really seen commonly in any of the machines, the gaming laptops here in 2021. This is the first where I've seen so much tape used. But that's not really too concerning. What concerns me the most about the interior of the Maingear is the location of the Nvme drives. The fact that they're stacked. This is the first laptop I've seen where they're sticking Gen 4 drives essentially right next to each other. And that's the reason that the thermal pad with heatsink is on the back cover, the bottom cover of this machine, so it just hits both of them. But I do worry a little bit about cooling and how hot that's going to get, and then the fact that the micro SD card slot reader is right here. That's its ribbon cable folded underneath where the drives go with a piece of tape over it. Now, I'm not sure how well that's going to hold up. Hopefully you're able to see all of this really clearly. It's just, I would say the strong suit of this machine is performance, but on the inside, it's far from the cleanest that I've seen. That doesn't mean that this won't hold up over time. I can't really attest to that. But what I can tell you is that this is not one of the better, cleaner internal engineering and craftsmanship jobs I've seen thus far. And maybe that's the cost of getting all of the features this has on paper, which generally would retail for over $3,000 at a $2,300 or $2,500 US price point, depending on whether you go with Amazon or directly through Micro Center. And I will have links for both of these in the description. I should have said that at the top, but I'm saying it now. Also, we've got this gap here, which, I've seen other builds of this chassis from other manufacturers, or I should say companies that brand it and then custom configure a little bit, because the majority of this does come pre-built from China, and usually this isn't a cavity like that. So another interesting thing to point out. The tape, again, I'm not so concerned about. It's just not aesthetically pleasing. It makes you wonder, how much of a rush job was employed here. Tape here, tape here, tape here. Again, the tape under the Nvme drives, the folded ribbon cable here, folded ribbon cable here. I'm not trying to harp, but this is just something you don't see a lot of on high-end machines that cost over $2,000, even if they are a bargain. So let's move on to the HP. That gives you a good look at the Maingear Vector Pro. Remember, both of these laptops have what, in my opinion, is a phenomenal display. They're in fact identical 17.3-inch IPS QHD displays that have 165 Hz refresh rates, ideal for their respective gaming chipsets, whether we're talking about the 3070 here in the Omen or the 3080 in the Vector Pro. And by the way, the Vector Pro does also come in a 3070 configuration. It also has AMD flavors of CPU if you prefer it. So good to know. Now here, much cleaner. We even have uniformity on the RAM and NVMe. As I showed you before, it's Samsung across the board, at least in the build I got. You may notice already, no tape jobs here. I mean, this is really clean, and it just seems like the engineering, there was a lot more thought put into this, and it doesn't seem anywhere near as rushed. Every part of the chassis is used. And I'm not saying that this is a perfect machine. Neither of them are. I'll talk about performance in a moment. But it's just interesting to see what is employed. This is fairly standard that the NVMEs are mirrored on each side of the chassis. And that's why I was surprised that they are sandwiched together in the Maingear Vector Pro. Our Wi-Fi chipset right there. They share the same chipset, for those of you that are wondering. And beefier fans on this machine than on the Vector Pro, and it's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, it's good for cooling, but they do have a constant whirling even when we're in just a productivity mode. That's one area where the Vector Pro, I think, excels over the HP Omen 17, is that the fan solution isn't quite as loud. I mean, under load, they're both loud, but these definitely can they are more powerful, the fans in the Omen 17. Now also keep in mind that the Omen 17 has a 330 watt power brick, whereas the Vector Pro over there on the right has a 230 watt brick, which is impressive considering the amount of power that each of these brings to the table. You know, if you don't use the 330 watt brick that comes with the Omen 17 and you use an HP 230, it'll work, it'll charge it up, but you will not get the full performance out of the CPU-GPU pairing. And also, I don't think it's a huge deal that the secondary slot is not Gen 4. I prefer having two Gen 4 drives. That's clear. We're in the 11th generation Intel chipset lineup. That's one of the key advantages over AMD's offerings. For those of you that follow both chip makers, which you should, they are on even keel these days. Intel's main advantage is operating, having more performance at full power, and of course having faster storage with the Gen 4 drive support as well as Thunderbolt connectivity, which you will not get with AMD. AMD's big advantage at off power, meaning not connected to the power brick, it will outperform the Intel chips at lower power delivery. So that's a benefit as well as battery life, but otherwise Intel's 11th gen chips have taken the title back in terms of overall performance, and I do prefer it even though I own the Asus G15, which is an AMD-based laptop. Still a fantastic one. Now, I did test in this machine the Sabrent 8TB Rocket Q, and it worked perfectly well. Of course, it does work in the Omen as well, and that was important to me because, believe it or not, this drive is really hard to get to work inside laptops. It just demands a lot of power, and most laptops don't deliver it. So part of the nicety of 2021 is that we do have laptops where you can now throw 16 gigs of storage internally, you know, throwing two of those Rocket Q 8TB in, and you'll be good to go. Now, they aren't Gen 4 drives. To my knowledge, Sabrent hasn't introduced an 8TB Gen 4 drive yet. And with Gen 5 around the corner, you may want to wait. But either way, both of these can be upgraded to 64 gigs of RAM. I did test both of them with 64 gigs, had no issue. It didn't change benchmarking. Of course, it's really just additional headroom for what you plan on doing. But let's talk about performance now. I mentioned the fans being stronger here. With the Vector Pro, when you're just doing regular productivity work, anything that's not intensive, the fans are relatively quiet. There are some, it's not coil whine I hear, but some electrical noises that you will not experience with the Omen 17. But on the flip side, in productivity, the Omen 17 does emit a whirling noise. Now, whether or not that's going to be addressable with a firmware update, I don't know. We'll see over time. I'm also waiting because I may be getting a 3080 version of this, also with 16 gigs of VRAM, just like the Maingear, which would have been a better comparison overall, but this is what I have to work with. The good news is that this is still a monster. I mean, at its price point, really tough to beat. The same applies to the Maingear Vector Pro. That's what's unique about both of these builds. So again, roughly $2,000 on the left, 23 or 2,500 on the right. And while I'm not in love with the way this looks on the inside, I do prefer its external appearance to the Omen. And also the fact that it's thin and light is great, but one disadvantage to it being thin and light is the overall I/O. So let's go over that right now, and then I'm going to flip these over and talk about the keyboard experience and trackpad. So on the Vector Pro, we have a micro SD card reader, two Type A USB ports right there, and then on the back of the machine, that's where all the action pretty much is, Thunderbolt 4, wish we had more than one of those, HDMI 2.1, and then Ethernet and the power connector, the pin port right there. And then on the left side, even though it's our right, USB Type A right there, as well as a dedicated microphone and headphone jack. Now, there's nothing wrong with this I/O. It's perfectly suitable. It's enough, but I do wish we had more than one Type-C port. We also do not have power delivery on either of these Thunderbolt 4 ports. Keep that in mind. You can only charge these with the brick. Hopefully that changes next generation. Intel, if you're listening, HP, if you're listening, and I would say Maingear, but again, Maingear didn't literally make that. Nothing but ventilation on the back of the Omen, and as I've stated, it does a great job cooling. And then on what is the left side, but our right, the power pin right there, Ethernet, Type A, display port, which you are not getting on the Maingear Vector Pro. That may or may not matter to you. HDMI, Thunderbolt, full-size SD card reader as well as a headphone microphone combo jack. This card reader is best in class for me so far. It's one of the fastest card readers I've had the pleasure of using. And then 2 Type A USB ports. And that's pretty much it. You know, not much else to show in terms of the chassis. Thicker, a little bit more robust in build quality, but I will say the finish is definitely prone to fingerprints. So again, I don't know whether or not, you know, over time, this solution that the Maingear Vector Pro is employing is going to be an issue. I don't know whether or not the fact that the 2 NVMEs being literally nearly kissing is going to be an issue, but it's something I felt everyone needs to know about because this is such an attractive machine, both in terms of its form factor and performance. This still will outperform, as I've mentioned over and over again, the Omen, but only about, you know, 10 to 15%. So that means when it comes to video rendering, that's been my experience. And when it comes to gaming, if we're going to talk about the native resolution of the panel, which I think is a really good way of looking at it, you know, you're talking about getting somewhere around 100 frames per second at the QHD res with this machine in pretty much any title on Earth right now set to ultra, whereas here you're going to be getting more in the, you know, high 80s, 90s, possibly mid 70s. You know, is that worth the price difference between the 3080, even though this is the most affordable 3080 on the market right now? And most importantly, both of these are actually available, something I cannot say about most PC gear, let alone laptops right now. And a lot of people obviously are after laptops because desktops have become impossible to build or even purchase to some degree. So something to think about. Remember, taking this apart is much more difficult than this by design. Again, I think HP did a really nice job with this redesign on the Omen 17. But one thing you will notice, now moving to the exterior, is that fingerprints really get collected on this machine in a way that they do not on the Maingear. The Maingear's matte finish, just even if you've got clammy hands, and I'm putting it to the test right now, you can see those marks pretty much disappear instantly, nearly instantly. Whereas here, they are collected. It is like an oil trap, and you can see it. Obviously, I've had this longer, used it longer, more of a long-term element to anything I have to say about the Omen, but the fingerprints just collect on it in a way that I wish they wouldn't. I don't really have anything against the Omen logo, just as I have nothing against the Maingear logo. I think they're both really subdued and don't look like gaming machines, which is how I prefer it. Now, when it comes to the actual displays, both are matte finish. For those of you unaware, both can easily be opened with one hand, even though I just two-handed each of them. And let's get into my final thoughts here. Battery life is similar on these two. You can disable the GPU and work with integrated Iris Xe graphics. So that's definitely good for battery life. You know, realistically speaking, I would say 3 to 4 hours is a realistic estimate with the GPU, you know, full blown, ready to go. Obviously off of a power brick, you're not going to get full performance out of it, but you're still going to have quite a bit more performance than obviously operating without the dedicated or discrete GPU. When you go to integrated GPU, 6 hours I think is realistic. You might be able to get more than that, but I don't want to overpromise and then everyone's like, what the hell happened? Now, the displays are identical. Both have a little bit of backlight bleed, but I think it is acceptable considering these are bleeding edge. You see what I did there? We've got 720p webcams on each. No privacy switches. Wish that would be incorporated, but apparently no one really thinks gamers care. That's not completely true of all manufacturers, but at least in this conversation. And we do have Windows Hello support, IR capability here. We do not have that with the Omen 17, if that matters to you. Maingear made a, again, Intel reference design, not Maingear, made a major improvement with this machine, moving the webcam from the nose-up position that everybody hated up to where it belongs at the top center of the display. Keyboards. Omen wins it, no question about it. These are both 4-zone RGB keyboards, but you can configure the Omen with per key, as well as more advanced mechanical switches than come stock. If you were lucky enough to get the Best Buy model, then you got the top tier keyboard. But even this one that I have here, which is the mainstream one, nice and clicky, and boy do I prefer this over the mechanical keyboard with the Maingear Vector Pro. And that's just because I'm not a huge fan of the squished keyboard. Now granted, you get a numerical keypad, which is really nice. Don't have it here, but I can live without it. And also we do get these programmable keys, which as a content creator and gamer are a win going both ways. We also have the dedicated Omen button, which takes you into your performance, overclocking, as well as fan control, all of that good stuff. Here we have a performance button as well, which cycles you through the 3 preset modes that Maingear has designed with their software, which basically just gets customized in China, I think, essentially to whatever vendor decides to brand and buy these in bulk. In this case, Maingear. Electronics is another big one. They do much more hands-on stuff, but their build of this machine currently doesn't even have the 11th gen Intel processor, and if it did, it would be about $3,200 US. So this thing is still a steal, and right now is the highest overall performance that I've seen from a machine in 2021, or ever in my life, I should say. Power button here, power button here. I really like, besides the fact that I prefer this keyboard, that we do have what HP's been doing for a while now, which is they give you LEDs to let you know that you've muted the audio or the microphone. It's just really smart to give you a visual cue rather than just a button. I'm not a huge, once you have that luxury with HP, it may sound ridiculous. It's a nice thing to have, especially in the age of video chatting, video conferencing, Zoom calls, Skype becoming paramount because of the pandemic. Both have really nice trackpads, but I will say, believe it or not, the Vector Pro's glass trackpad feels a little bit nicer. So that goes to Maingear. I already mentioned that the audio on both of these, not fantastic on either, but the Omen 17 does take the win there. The audio performance is better overall. And again, today's video was supposed to be about the internals, but I figured I'm going to cover everything. Both of these machines will get hot under load, so I don't recommend having them on your lap when you're obviously gaming or rendering video, even photo, video editing in general. Always best to have these on a laptop stand or a hard surface like you're looking at right now. But the good news is you can't go wrong with either one of these, and hopefully this video has shed light on an overall comparison in terms of what they look like inside. After all, this video is all about what's under the hood. And then I did, recap what you're looking at in terms of aesthetics and overall experience with the exterior of the machine and the I/O. Again, they are both great. I like them both. I don't think you can go wrong. Now, my experience, this is in closing, with the Omen 17 kind of led me to feel like, maybe I would be better served upgrading from my G15. And that's part of the reason I purchased the Maingear Vector Pro. Unfortunately, Maingear didn't have any review units to ship over. I reached out because, again, this is not physically being made by Maingear, and that's something you should be aware of regarding warranty. If you have any sort of warranty issues with this, you will be dealing with Micro Center. That's not a bad thing. I wish I had a Micro Center where I live now. I did where I used to live with 3.5% sales tax. It was a blessing. Unfortunately, I haven't ever since I moved. And basically, you'll either be going to your local Micro Center for technical, physical support with this if anything goes wrong, or shipping it into Micro Center. Maingear will give you phone support, which is always good because Maingear does have some of the better support in the business. And if you're not familiar with Maingear, they are a boutique builder out of Jersey that makes some really nice rigs if you ever want to go custom. I've done it in the past. Different flavor for everybody. They essentially accommodate whatever you could possibly want. HP, as we know, one of the largest manufacturers of PCs in the world, and that's why, well, they have designed their machine top to bottom on their own. No reference here. Much thicker, much heavier, a couple pounds difference without the power brick, which is only going to take it up even more. The power brick here is literally twice the size of the 230 watt brick that comes with the Vector Pro. And I'm actually glad that the reference design kept that brick small, otherwise it would undo the thin and light nature of this beast of a machine. So hopefully that rounds everything out. For me with the G15, I was really hoping that this machine was going to blow it away. And look, it does bring in probably about a 20% solid performance improvement over everything I can do with the Max Q3070 and Ryzen 9 in there, but that's just still not enough for me to say it's time to spend an extra, a fresh $2,300 US after tax, closer to $2,500. If it was a 50% jump in overall performance, I think it would be pretty easy to swallow, but then I might be a little bit disturbed by what I saw under the hood here. Whether or not that bothers you, I'm really interested to hear from all of you that this video appealed to. I think HP, the physical aesthetics being thicker, the design isn't as nice as the reference, but we already know it's not always just the exterior, it's also the interior, and that's where I think HP seems like the craftsmanship and overall engineering is vastly superior. But then you've got the whirling fan noise that the Vector Pro doesn't. So again, all things being equal, as I've stated, you can't go wrong, and hopefully this video has shed light on your expectations, both, again, using this if you never open it, as well as, more importantly, if you ever plan to upgrade it and actually get in there. Remember, Gold Key RAM versus Samsung RAM, both 980 Pros, but an edge here, and only one Gen 4 slot, but two here. That may end up being complicated because they are kissing, which does concern me a little bit. So I can't speak to longevity, but extended warranties exist, and that is the reason they do. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it gave you some potential insight and information. This has led me to believe I'm better off sticking with my G15. Now, if I didn't own the G15, then I would probably be looking to get a custom config of the Omen 17, very similar to what I presently have here. Don't need the i9, just a little more clock speed. It's not going to be a tangible difference for the additional money, but everything else about it is excellent. But if I needed thin and light, you already know this is the way I would go. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them, hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.